Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with some symphonies in the exotic key of C-sharp minor. Now, why is this key exotic? Well, there are a bunch of reasons, but the funny thing about it is that it's only a half step above the plain vanilla, everyday, average, basic starter piano, white keys only key of C major. But go up one half step and the universe changes. Now, C-sharp minor is normally, as I'm working up the scale here, I start major, minor, whatever. But I have to do C-sharp minor because C-sharp major doesn't really exist as a useful key. Most people prefer to use D-flat major, which is the same key basically in our well-tempered tonal system. There really isn't any difference between the two, except that notationally D-flat is easier for musicians to read than C-sharp major. So C-sharp major very seldom factors as an actual key signature in most music, but D-flat does turn up. So D-flat we'll deal with as we get to the Ds. So for the C-sharp key family, major and minor, we're only going to deal with C-sharp minor, and it happens to be a surprisingly interesting and frequently used key. Now, the iconic work in C-sharp minor is not a symphony. It's Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. And it's very interesting. Beethoven had this capability. It's an interesting musicological question or an aesthetic question. Either he embodied the individual essence of a key as no one ever had before and crystallized what it could express, or his music in a specific key, especially the more unusual ones, was so powerful and so expressively clear and direct that it defined what that key meant for future generations. It was Beethoven who decided what C-sharp minor was, and not C-sharp minor itself that decided the kind of music that Beethoven was going to write. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if there is an answer. It could be perhaps a combination of the two. It really could. But the fact is, the Moonlight Sonata has certain characteristics that I think we find in music in C-sharp minor. And there's evidence on both sides of the key determining the music and the music determining later aspects of the key. We're going to talk about both of them because the Moonlight Sonata, as you know, was marked Sonata quasi una fantasia, which by which Beethoven meant that it's a sonata in the manner of a fantasia or fantasy or improvisation. And I mean, there's nothing less improvised than the Moonlight Sonata, even though the sonata movement, the movement in sonata form, comes last. It begins, of course, with the moonlight thing, and it's so poetic and so beautiful and so unbelievably evocative. I mean, if you didn't know that was C-sharp minor, you do after you hear that first movement. Then there's a light little sort of minuet-y thing, and then the turbulent, stormy, passionate finale. So those two poles, that sort of dreamy fantasy, fantasia-like opening, followed by eventually that stormy, turbulent finale, kind of gave us the parameters of what C-sharp minor evokes. But the interesting thing about it is there is a bit of a precedent in C-sharp minor, and it is a symphony, an early symphony. It's by Joseph Martin Krauss. Now, Joseph Martin Krauss lived from, 17 years were almost the same as Mozart's. They were the same as Mozart's, 1756 to 1792. And he wrote a whole four-movement symphony in C-sharp minor, with wind parts too, which would have been very unusual because you couldn't use trumpets or modern brass because they couldn't play chromatic keys back in those days. It would have been very difficult to do unless you had special crooks made where you take out bits of tubing and reinsert it. And he has horns in this symphony, which is also quite interesting. But this symphony begins with a slow movement that has a markedly funeral march-like character. And that turns out to be prophetic because, I mean, you could argue that the opening of the Moonlight Sonata is slightly, vaguely, dreamily march-like as well, because the actual melody is dum ba bum, which is a march type rhythm, you know. So anyway, here is a bit. I got to play you a bit of this opening movement. It's an extraordinary symphony. This is with Concerto Cone, and it's part of the Phoenix edition, which is actually, the label is Capriccio. And you really ought to hear these symphonies. They're really very, very good. He was a fine, fine composer. And boy, oh boy, yes, this is the earliest symphony in C sharp minor that I'm aware of. And it also seems to evoke something of that dreamy, otherworldly, and also sad funeral march type character that this key perhaps stimulates composers to evoke. Anyway, here you go. Here's the opening. Kind of cool, isn't it? For an exact contemporary of Mozart and Haydn, Krauss was the real deal, and his tragic early death was a tragic early death, just as Mozart's was. But that is the earliest symphony in C sharp minor that I've ever found, and one of the earliest instrumental pieces in C sharp minor that's out there, that we may encounter. And I think that it really does say something about what that key meant for a composer of the day. And perhaps Beethoven was also part of the C sharp minor family. So then there's the Moonlight Sonata. Then the C sharp minor is basically sidelined for most of the Romantic period, and we're going to jump all the way to the 20th century because they're really you just don't see it very often. You just don't, especially in symphonies. But once you get to the 20th century, there's a whole slew of wonderful, wonderful symphonies in C sharp minor. And the interesting thing about it is that they really do pick up where Beethoven left off, in many respects. One of the finest and one of the most beautiful, and it's just totally unknown, and I don't understand why, is this one, Ernest Bloch. Ernest Bloch wrote his early symphony in C sharp minor. This was a student composition, or an early composition, let's put it that way. But it is a big, full-blown, Straussian, yummy, juicy, fin de siècle, decadent C sharp minor romantic symphony. And I'm going to play you a bit of the scherzo, because the scherzo has this wonderful world of fantasy about it. And I couldn't help but think of the Moonlight Sonata, even though this is quick music and somewhat sardonic music, and the Moonlight Sonata isn't. But the atmosphere, the atmosphere. It has that C-sharp minor-y atmosphere of exotic fantasy. I don't know. Does it? Here, you decide. This is the London Symphony, conducted by Dahlia Atlas on Naxos. That's such a great piece this is. Here. Isn't that extraordinary? Go out and get this disc. It's fantastic. It comes also with his Poems of the Sea, which are marvelous. It's just a wonderful work to get to know. Very, very few people do, and I think it's really exceptional. It's only basically been recorded a couple times. There's a very good one on Bis. Gunzenhauser did it with the Slovak Philharmonic on Marco Polo way back, but that was superseded on the Naxos labels by this one with Dahlia Atlas. And the first one was done by like a community orchestra in St. Louis. But the Gunzenhauser recording on Marco Polo was one of the very first pieces that I actually had to hear when I was doing the first hearing review show on WQXR, when I was an occasional visitor to WQXR to do that series. And it was very, very funny because they put it on as the mystery piece. And I remember the show vividly. I was on it with the conductor Antonio de Almeida, and we became fast friends as a result of that show. And the critic Bert Wexler, who was totally dyspeptic about most things. And I knew what the piece was because I had that earlier community orchestra from St. Louis LP that was the only extant recording of it at the time. It was very, very funny. But I got to tell you, it's an amazing work. Absolutely amazing. So give Ernest Bloch a shot. Next, we're going quasi-chronologically, not entirely, because the block came a little bit after the piece I'm going to talk about now, and that was the most famous C sharp minor symphony in the repertoire, and it's Mahler's Fifth. Yes, Mahler's Fifth, believe it or not, begins in C sharp minor. That opening funeral march is in C sharp minor. And like Beethoven, Mahler had the ability to take a key and somehow crystallize the expressive implications of at least some aspects of it. And because Mahler wrote in what we call progressive tonality, that is, the symphony doesn't end in the same key that it began in, pardon me. It evolves into different keys and reaches a final destination. Only the first movement is in C sharp minor, basically. But wowie, wow, wow, wow. What a C sharp minor it is. Let me just play the opening. You know it, but let's hear it again because it has that intensity of feeling and that funeral march character that C sharp minor seems to bring out in so many composers. Here it is. That was the Utah Symphony with Maurice Abravanel in Mahler's Fifth. Yes, C sharp minor. And around, it seems, the fin de siècle period, 1900, up to 1920, there were a bunch of C sharp minor things going on in the world of romantic composition. Really good C sharp minor stuff going on. I mean, really good. One of the other fabulous symphonies in C sharp minor is the Fourth Symphony of Alberic Magnard. Now, Magnard was the greatest French symphonist before Roussel. He's only in the past couple of decades begun to receive his due. He wrote 4 symphonies. He was an extraordinary individualist, and he was murdered by the advancing German armies during World War I. He barricaded himself in his farmhouse. He lived apparently, sort of around Strasbourg on the Maginot Line. And as soon as the Germans came onto his property, he started shooting and they blew him up, which was a terrible loss to music. But this is an exceptional symphony, his Fourth Symphony. I mean, the third and fourth, they're all 4 are worth listening to. But the fourth is really hot stuff. And I got to play you the opening. The opening features the motto theme for the whole symphony. And boy, is this C sharp minor music. The aching, yearning, passionate, fantastical aspect of it. Oh my God, it just makes you want to listen to the rest of it compulsively, which is exactly what I did the first time I heard it. So here it is, the opening of Magnard's Fourth Symphony in C sharp minor. This is Fabrice Bolland with the Philharmonisches Orchester Freiburg, also on Naxos. Yeah, I love that heavy post-Wagnerian chromatic French sweaty. Oh, God, it's wonderful. Isn't it just wonderful stuff? Fantastic. Now, considerably later, well, we're talking, I think, the 1930s by now, 1920s or 30s or 32. Yeah, 32. We find another very evocative, I mean seriously evocative symphony in C-sharp minor. It's by our dear friend from another planet, Arnold Bax. Yes, his Fifth Symphony is in C-sharp minor. The first movement doesn't start there, but it ends there. And from there on, it's smooth C-sharp minor sailing, more or less. Now, Bax's style was rather chromatic. It was very tonally unstable, and so it doesn't settle in any one key for huge periods of time quite often. But this is a very interesting symphony also because it confirms the funeral march-like character of so much music in C-sharp minor. That's how the symphony opens, with a very, very stern funeral march, soft and muffled for percussion and woodwinds. And the finale, which is going to play you a bit, when it really gets going, I think gives us the more stormy and turbulent aspect of C-sharp minor, such as we find in the finale of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. So this is the Royal Scottish National Orchestra with David Lloyd-Jones on Naxos in Bax's Symphony No. 5 and C-sharp minor. Holy cow, who'd have thunk it? Yeah. Are we beginning to hear a little bit of what C-sharp minor does for us as a key? I just think this is really cool because, so many of these keys are rather nondescript. I mean, you can do anything you want with them, or they're used so frequently, they have such a wide range of application that the emotional ambience that surrounds them is very, very wide. You can't make any sort of generalizations from it. But it seems that C-sharp minor has something that Krauss heard and Beethoven heard and all these later composers heard. What that something is, again, I leave it to you to define for yourself. Now, I have two more examples of this. 7, and there are more. There are quite a few more. For example, Pfitzner wrote a symphony in C-sharp minor, which you can go out and listen to if you like. I'm not a big Pfitzner fan myself, so I'm not going to play it for you here. But and I also don't think it's a terribly interesting work. Fitzner's orchestral music is not as interesting as some of his vocal music and other things. But there are a couple more, and some of these are really cool. One of them that you probably also don't think about as a C-sharp minor work is Prokofiev's Seventh and Last Symphony. That symphony is in C-sharp minor, which I think is kind of remarkable because everybody sort of craps on the Seventh Symphony as a weak work that was written in his later days, and it was written for a youth orchestra or for kids or something, and it was supposedly easy to take, and so it's not. It is easy to take. It's very melodic, but because it's very melodic, because it's extremely tonal, he is able to exploit the special quality of C-sharp minor in the first movement, I think, very effectively. In fact, it probably is not too much of a stretch to say that the opening subject of the Seventh Symphony really comes the closest to evoking that sort of gloomy, sad, but also somewhat fantastical character that you hear all the way back in Joseph Martin Krauss's symphony, that opening movement, because they're both slowish andante movements that have quicker aspects to them, and they're both in C-sharp minor, and I think that's really just so cool. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. It's a coincidence, but is it a coincidence arising from the special character of C-sharp minor? I don't know. I'll just throw it out there, and we'll see where we go. Here's the opening of Prokofiev's Seventh with Theodore Kuchar and the National Symphony Orchestra of Ukraine on Naxos. Oh my God, I love this symphony. I don't know about the rest of you. I just think Prokofiev is great. And this is a beautiful, beautiful work. Yeah, C-sharp minor. See what I mean? I am not making this up. Last but not least, I think we can say that after Prokofiev's Seventh, which was written in the 1950s, the key ceased to have much relevance in modern music, because modern music is so tonally wayward that it's hard to pin anything down, any special character. And of course, the instruments evolved in such a way that they became fully chromatic throughout their ranges, and it was very difficult to hear a special quality of writing in any one key. For example, if you listen to Beethoven's Seventh, you listen to the horns. The horns in A major. Horns in A major sound a certain way in Beethoven's day. If you listen to Haydn's symphonies in A major, as part of my Haydn Symphony Crusade, I talk about this. You hear that same wonderfully open horn sonority and high register, because the notes that they could actually play were determined by the key that they were playing in, to a certain extent anyway. And after the end of towards the middle to the end of the 19th century, all of that became standardized, and all the keys became somewhat homogenized, and their special character was lost. Maybe that's why C sharp minor itself still retains something of its character as an unusual key at the beginning of the 20th century. But by the middle, everything was being played the same way by everybody. And here in C sharp minor is a little example of maybe a last remnant of C sharp minorosity, as we call it, as expressed in Havergal Brian's Symphony No. 16. Now, Brian wrote at least 3 keys nominally in C sharp minor, but Havergal Brian never stayed in any one key for all that long, especially in his later music, which is very, very gnarly and rather dissonant, and it's very hard to tell what key you're in for any particular reason. And not only is it hard to tell whatever particular key, but all of his music is full of march rhythms and this sort of militaristic, funeral marchy character. So you can't say that C sharp minor produced it more than any other key. But I want to play you just a bit of Symphony No. 16. This is with the new Russian State Symphony Orchestra under Alexander Walker on Naxos, so that you can get a sense. Thank you, Naxos. I gotta say, they have all this repertoire. Who needs anybody else? Especially when you're looking for something that's off the beaten path, right? Anyway, here's a bit of Havergal Brian's Symphony No. 16, which is nominally in C sharp minor. Yeah, I'm not sure there's that much C sharp minorness left in C sharp minor by the time we get to this, but there it is. And one of the things that I think we've shown is that in order for keys, specific keys, to have individuality for certain composers, those composers have to be obviously tonal composers, but not just tonal composers as in they write tunes and those tunes are in keys and you can hum them. I mean tonal composers who buy into the entire system of traditional harmony and key relationships, and who write music that's based on the expressive outcome of the juxtaposition of keys and the relationships between them. And as the 19th century wore on, the number of composers doing that became strikingly smaller, because music became, thanks to Wagner, more chromatic, and as it became more chromatic, the special character of these keys was weakened. And so you need to find composers who really still understood or had a feeling for what traditional harmony meant, or what they could make it mean. I don't know. Again, it's a chicken or the egg argument, which came first. But these guys did. These 7 composers for 7 symphonies in C sharp minor, I think, give us a special quality in their music. You tell me if you agree. I think it's a fascinating question, and this series is going to be asking this question every time we hit another key, and we have plenty of them to cover. We're only on C sharp. This is our 3rd key. Next will be D flat major, which is going to be very, very interesting, I think. So thank you for joining me. Keep on listening, folks. Take care.